Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Chairside Chats with Polk County's preeminent historians. I am Lou Ann Mims. I am the Special Collections Librarian with the Lakeland Public Library, and I'll be acting as your guide as we join in conversation with our two guests. By the way, this presentation is being recorded. This event is a collaboration between two organizations, the Lawton Chiles Center for Florida History, which is located on the campus of Florida Southern College at the McKay Archive Center. The center was founded in 2001, and it seeks to preserve the state's past through cooperative efforts with historical societies, preservation groups, museums, public programs, media, and interested public. We are also brought by the Lakeland Public Library. We have 3 branches that serve the greater Lakeland and Polk County area. It is also home to the Lakeland History Room, which is soon to be expanded to offer exhibits in addition to the rich resources of the collection. Many stories connecting one community is the mission for the Lakeland History and Culture Center to be centered in the library. Our presenters this evening are both well known in our local community and throughout the state of Florida. We're very happy to have them with us this evening. We have Dr. Cantor Brown Jr. and Dr. James Mike Denham. They'll be telling us a bit about their latest publications and then moving on to update us on what they're currently working on. And the remainder of the program will then be fielding questions that have been sent in earlier. So let's get started with our program. First, I would like to formally introduce our speakers this evening. Dr. Cantor Brown Jr. is a historian, professor, and author. He was born in Fort Meade, Florida, and earned his degrees, BA, JD, PhD, all at Florida State University. He taught at Florida A&M University and retired from Fort Valley State University in Fort Valley, Georgia. Brown has written on Florida and southern United States history, including Florida's Peace River frontier, earning him the Florida Historical Society's Rembrandt W. Patrick Award and the Ossian Bing Hart Florida Loyalist Reconstructioner Governor, winner of the Certificate of Commendation of the American Association of State and Local History. Joining Dr. Brown is Dr. James M. Denham, a professor of history and director of the Lawton M. Chiles Center for Florida History at Florida Southern College. He has taught there since 1991. Denham received his PhD from FSU, and he is the author or co-author of 7 books, which include Florida founder William P. Duval, Frontier Bon Vivant, and most recently, The Letters of George Long Brown, a Yankee merchant of the Florida antebellum frontier. Denham is a frequent contributor to Florida Public Radio. In 2015, the Florida Historical Society awarded Denham the Rembrandt Patrick Book Prize for 50 Years of Justice. In 2016, the Board of Directors of the Florida House on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., named him Florida Distinguished Author of the Year. So as you can see, we have 2 preeminent historians with us tonight, and both of these historians have added to the greater field of knowledge for celebrating and advancing Florida history. So let us begin. I would like to have Dr. Brown, if you could tell us a little bit about your latest book that is actually out for the general public.
Well, I'd be delighted to. Could I take just a second on 2 things? One, I want to make sure people understand the great programs and public service being performed by the Lakeland Public Library. I think that goes unheralded. I think that the library and its wonderful staff have shown time and again their dedication to this community and this county. They deserve the support of the public, of the city of Lakeland, and of the Polk County government. And I'm so delighted at the new expansion, and I'm sure we'll get into talking about that at some point. But the fact that we will have a center for understanding our local history and the richness of its diversity is a wonderful contribution that's going to serve the community well in the future. The second thing I wanted to say, I'm honored to be here with my friend Mike Denham. And I want to point out the same is true of him that I just mentioned about the library. You've been here, what, 26 years now? A native of Orlando. He's not a foreigner, but he has worked such magic in bringing history to the people of Polk County, in enriching the intellectual and educational atmosphere at Florida Southern College and in Lakeland generally, and through his acclaimed Florida Lecture Series, which has brought top quality creative people from all over the country here to Lakeland in an informal setting to share their work and to enrich the lives of our people here. And he deserves great credit for that, and it's an honor for me to be here with him. Now I'll brag a little bit on myself. My latest book is on Henry Bradley Plant. And I think everyone who's lived in Florida for very long has heard the name Plant, at least in terms of Plant Hall at the University of Tampa, that beautiful Moorish-looking building on the west side of the Hillsborough River that is a part of the University of Tampa. They will have heard of possibly a Plant High School in Tampa, Morton Plant Hospital in Pinellas County, which is his son. But what they don't know is that Henry Plant was the man who created the concept that became modern Florida. He was the one that figured out how to integrate transportation and resorts that would attract people from elsewhere to Florida, even if, as turned out to be true in his case, he wanted them to then go on to someplace else, specifically to Havana, Cuba. But in the process, he built railroads, he built magnificent resorts like the Tampa Bay Hotel, now Plant Hall. He had steamship lines. At one time, he owned the most luxurious and largest passenger steamship in the world, La Grande Duchesse. And along the way, he earned the reputation of being a wonderful person to work for. In a time when Jim Crow racial discrimination was setting in the South, he treated his employees equally in terms of pay, in terms of benefits. In the process, he created a model health care program that was available without racial restrictions to all his employees. He created profit-sharing programs years ahead of its time and was beloved because of this. And perhaps most importantly for us tonight, he, more than any other single individual, sparked the creation of Lakeland. It was his railroad, and to a great extent, his people who provided the incentive, who provided the ideas and direction for how Lakeland came to be founded in 1884 and 1885, and then that sustained Lakeland for generations and generations and generations as a railroad town, and a position we still occupy to some extent. It was a delight to research his life, because it was one of those situations where every time you scratched the surface, it turned out that he had fibbed a little bit in the way he had told it, but the truth was so much more interesting and so much more relevant. And the biography came out officially at Plant Hall at the Tampa Bay Hotel on Plant's 200th birthday in October of last year. And what a wonderful day that was for me. And I hope he was looking down and thinking, well, Brown didn't do that shabby a job. But I encourage people, if they are interested, to please take a look at it. I think it's probably available through the Lakeland Public Library. I'm hearing yes, it is. And I would look forward to hearing from anybody if they do have a chance to take a look at it and have anything they'd like to talk about.
Well, thank you so much. It is a very eye-opening book, especially, as you're saying, with Lakeland's history. So thank you. Dr. Denham, I've got a couple of your latest works up on the screen here. If you wanted to expand on the subject of either of those books, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Well, I want to echo Cantor's accolades for the work you're doing here in Lakeland and the Lakeland Room and the expansion. Wow, it's going to be really exciting. And I want to give a shout out to you and all of your staff and your superiors and so forth, and all of the people that are investing and promoting Lakeland history. It's a wonderful resource, and it's kind of a pretty well kept secret. You've got so many gems in there, and now you're going to be able to really expand it and flesh it out and even display some of the material in a way that you weren't able to do before. Well, I'm really glad to be here tonight, and as Cantor mentioned, I've got a couple of recent books up there. I'm not sure what the audience can see, but last year, actually, about the same time as Cantor came out with his book on Plant, I was able to complete, I think, about 20-some years of work on one of the most interesting families that I've ever gotten to know. And the reason I got to know them is because I got to read their mail. Something like 800 or 900 letters that I discovered at West Point Military Academy in New York in the middle 1990s. And my collaborator on this project was English professor, he may be watching tonight, Keith Honeycutt. And we finally finished this book called Echoes from a Distant Frontier about two sisters who came to Florida, the Florida frontier, before the Seminole Wars, or right as the Second Seminole War was about to break out, and read their writings to their brother, who was actually in Europe at the time, and we were just really kind of hooked on this project. And over the years, we went through something like 900 letters and wrote two books, on the two sisters that came out in 2004, and then their brother, who you see up there on the top. And fortunately, we were able to work with family members and find photographs and images. Now, this image of George Brown, the brother of the two sisters, was probably 1850 daguerreotype, and we were able to recover that from the family members. And one of the siblings was actually an artist, so he was drawing their images all along. Anyway, this gentleman lived in Alachua County in a place called Noonensville, which no longer exists. It was the county seat of Alachua County. He was a merchant. He worked with his brother-in-law, and they established a merchant operation in Noonensville, Florida, a place that we don't know anything about. But it was, again, the county seat. It had the U.S. Land Office there. It had forts, military forts, where people from the outlying areas would come to hide out during the Seminole Wars, and military officers coming in and out of there. It was a place where people came and went constantly, and we didn't know anything about it. But here were 100, 200 letters written from Noonensville. It's an amazing discovery. And so we were able to document the individuals that were written about and bring to life the economic, social, political growth of this frontier community through the eyes of this Yankee merchant, George Long Brown. And so this kind of goes back to the fun of doing history, and that is really doing the discovery and the digging and the primary research. And then the other book that you see up there was a biography of William Pope Duvall, which I worked on simultaneously. And Cantor, of course, can share this with me, and that is that we work on things simultaneously. We always have 2 or 3 things, sometimes at various stages of production: research, writing, rough drafts, starting new projects, etc. And I worked on this biography off and on for, Cantor's the one that kind of put me on it. Remember when I first came to Lakeland, you suggested that I meet with this gentleman who had compiled.
Well, way back when I was studying at
Go
the
ahead and take
University
it.
of Florida under Sam Proctor, who was really the dean of Florida historians and the longtime editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. And a fellow named Frank Schneider, who, as I recall, lived in Clearwater, submitted several articles, one on William Pope Duvall's wife, Nancy, and my memory is there was another one. But Sam Proctor felt that he was really on to something, and that he had compiled a wonderful reservoir of information, just a huge pool of information. But unfortunately, Frank was ill and was not long to live. And he came up to Gainesville, and Sam introduced us. And I was working on some other projects, but I mentioned Mike's work on frontier violence and antebellum Florida, which was called A Rogue's Paradise, which I think relates to Orlando, his hometown. I'm not sure about that. And we began talking, and like I say, we went and visited Frank at his home one time. And
This is right after I'd come to Florida Southern, within a year or two, really. So we're talking early 90s. Yeah, that's how far back this goes.
Yeah, and Frank, in wanting his work, his wonderful research, not to go unused, arranged in his will, he donated the papers to the University of South Florida, but limited access to them to Mike and I. And as I say, I was busy with other things, both finishing my PhD program and then working on a history of the Florida Supreme Court. But Mike was interested, and he pursued it. And
it was something that I really was already pretty much immersed in, because my first book was on the antebellum era. And Duvall was a person who's always there. He's always kind of in the mix. He's always being referred to. He was governor of territorial Florida for 12 years. He was appointed by 3 different presidents, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and then Andrew Jackson. So he was a mainstay in the territory, and he was the person who kind of developed the American civil process of the territory. So I didn't know a whole lot about him, other than I knew he was from Kentucky or somewhere like that. But the more I dug into the research, the more I found that he was a national figure with national connections. Washington Irving was his friend. Washington Irving wrote short stories about him. He was such a popular character, singer.
Talk about his role as a literary figure. Because
and I named the biography Bon Vivant, because I looked it up, and Bon Vivant means man of fun, man of it's kind of a French term which indicates lively stories and storytelling and tall tale telling and things like that. And that was Duvall, and I soon discovered that this guy was a charismatic personality, probably bipolar. He drank probably to excess a little bit every now and again, but he was just a magnetic character. But he was also a very, very sharp political operator with lots and lots of connections. And he came from very, very well-to-do background. His father was mayor of Richmond. His father was a friend, very close friend of George Washington. So he was connected, as they say, and that's how he got appointed to be first judge and then governor of territorial Florida. And so it was what is that, 25 years of research while I'm working on other things at the same time. And meanwhile, a book that Cantor and I put out together in 2000, remember Cracker Times? That was, you know, when I worked with Frank, I had not finished my first book yet, which I was determined to get done, and I had to put Duval on the back burner. That was finished. And then here comes Cantor with this idea of doing a book on George Keene, George Gillette Keene, which he discovered, and we did that together. And then the Echoes book kind of intruded, with the Brown sisters. And then finally, about 2004, 2005, I said, well, this is my time to finish the Duval book. So that's when I really started serious writing. I had been doing research, for 10 years, but that's when I started the serious writing. So it was quite a lot of work, but a lot of fun too. A lot of sense of accomplishment. This guy, he's really unknown and underappreciated, but not because he was really necessarily a great statesman or anything like that, but just really interesting and also absorbed and involved in so many different things. As a confidant to Andrew Jackson, but also as a very close friend to John C. Calhoun. And of course, those two individuals parted ways, and of course, the entire political structure of America really kind of short-circuited, right, during that Calhoun-Jackson fissure. And Duval was right in the middle of that stuff. So that was another national theme that I could use in the biography to follow through with the biography.
Now, would you say that once he had retired as governor of territorial Florida, that he just enjoyed his plantation and, lived out his life in peace and quiet?
No, everything went bad. Everything went wrong, He got absorbed in the Panic of 1837, and the banking collapses here in Florida, and he lived too long. He basically found himself on different issues, on the side of different issues. As things would obviously turn a certain way, he changed parties, and you never do that. And then he changed back, and he went broke, and he
Did he change states?
Pardon?
Did he change states?
Yes. I liken his situation to Davy Crockett. Many of your viewers will know the name Davy Crockett, and of course how Davy Crockett's reputation. Davy Crockett's reputation, of course, is one of these. Well, I think Duval was far more interesting and exotic and charismatic than Davy Crockett. But anyway, he's very similar to that ilk. But there's a story about Davy Crockett. Of course, he was in Tennessee, and when he lost an election in Tennessee, he told his constituents, he says, well, you can go to hell and I'm going to Texas. And that's kind of what Duval did. He followed his sons to Texas in the 1840s, about the time Texas became an American territory. The Republic of Texas, of course, before, but in fact, he was even involved in the Republic of Texas Revolution, the Revolution of Texas. He was even involved in that, and his sons, of course, were also involved, and his son was killed at the Battle of Goliad, which was one of the worst atrocities, really, during the Texas Revolution, in which Santa Anna murdered all of the survivors who had surrendered. So anyway, Duval he had his hand in everything, really.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that, and you also touched on a couple of concepts that I think most people don't understand about historians. One, that you build on the research that somebody else has maybe started,
right,
and you salvage that. The second aspect is the length of time that you spend on these subjects. I think that people think you're just cranking these books out and it takes a long time. And the third part that you mentioned actually segues into our next, which is the collaboration. You mentioned
Oh,
your
good.
Tiger Times
Yeah.
book, but if you guys wanted to talk about your recent collaboration with the governors of Florida.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, great. Well, we can't take credit for doing the project. We can take credit certainly for the pieces we wrote in it, but the real credit goes to Boyd Murphy and Bob Taylor, particularly Boyd Murphy, who envisioned this project probably about, 10 years ago.
Long time ago.
These things take a tremendous amount of time because you have to work with writers on each chapter. This is not a dictionary. This is not an encyclopedia. These are extensively written essays which engage each governor of the state of Florida in a substantial way to what they did, not only before and after they were as governor, but their whole gubernatorial career. So these are essays that are extensively written essays, written by different scholars. I think I wrote 3 or 4 essays, and I think Cantor wrote. Now tell everybody who you wrote, and I'll tell everybody who I wrote on.
Well, I had, Luann, you mentioned earlier that my doctoral dissertation was a biography of Florida Governor Ossian Hart, who was governor from 1872 till his death in 1874. He founded the Florida Republican Party. I felt that he was a remarkable man who deserved to be remembered. But as a result of that, his tenure came during the Reconstruction era. So I came to be identified with Florida's Reconstruction history. So Boyd subsequently asked me to write 3 of the 4 Reconstruction era governors. David Walker, who was a Democrat right after the war, Ossian Hart, and his successor, Marcellus Stearns. And then our dear friend Larry Rivers at Florida A&M wrote about the one other governor, Harrison Reed. I think the way Larry and I approached Reconstruction, people will find a little different, hopefully a little refreshing, but we did our best to humanize these 4 individuals. And it turned out, like in the case of Duvall, with the tragedies and calamities of his life, that their lives had ups and downs. And we tried to be fair about that. But how about your governors? Did they have ups and downs?
I should say so, including the first of those, Duval. So I wrote an essay on Duval, obviously. And his successor, interesting guy named John Eaton. Many of your readers will know the name John Eaton or Peggy Eaton. Peggy Eaton and John Eaton were married and, of course, broke up the Jackson administration. John Eaton was Secretary of War, and he had married Peggy Eaton, who was, of course, a woman of questionable character, etc. And the entire
to John C. Calhoun's.
And also Richard Keith Call, who was also one of the territorial governors. So, as Cantor wrote about Reconstruction governors, I wrote about territorial governors, beginning with Duval. So anyway, President Jackson kind of exiled John Eaton down to Florida. When Duval resigned in 1834, he sent John Eaton down here, and Peggy even came to Florida for a short period of time. And he was only governor here for about 2 years. The Second Seminole War broke out, and he split, basically. And then after him,
Well, he got a better job.
that's right, he got to be minister to Spain. Right?
Jackson appointed him ambassador to the Spanish Empire.
Yeah, right, and Peggy got to go to Spain, right. But then we skip over Call, who our friend Jim Cusick wrote about at University of Florida. And then the next governor that I wrote about was Robert Raymond Reed, who was an interesting governor who was probably one of the most unfortunate governors, who inherited the Second Seminole War, inherited the Panic of 1837, inherited also the yellow fever epidemic. So it was a 3 or 4 years of calamities for him. And then yet another Jackson cabinet member became governor, John Branch, who was a very well-to-do North Carolinian who was appointed just for a very brief time and was governor during the time when Florida became a state. So Florida became a state very briefly after that. So basically, I think Cantor would agree with me on this. Our goal was to tell the context of the time along with the governor itself, who was the executive at the time. So this book, which is kind of a reference book in a way, but also it's
I think
but it's also a book that people can read the essays on their own, because they make up very, very good essays about the time and the personalities of the governors themselves. So from start to finish, Duval up to Rick Scott is the last governor actually written about in here.
Okay,
And
there's two governors from Polk County.
right, and we also have another Polk County author,
Okay.
a Polk County author, and that's Billy Townsend. Billy Townsend wrote
about John
he
Martin.
wrote about John Martin, governor of the 1920s. So Billy is, most people know Billy is quite an accomplished writer as well, and has written a lot of good history. And so Billy actually did an article or an essay here as well. But you're right, we have 3 Polk County governors.
3.
3, and they're in here.
And they are
They're
Holland,
Spessard Holland,
Park Trammell,
Park Trammell, and Lawton Childs.
Lawton
I was
Childs.
hoping you were going to remember that.
So it sounds like
In chronological order. Pardon?
I said it sounds like an interesting read, especially if you want to find out more about
Yeah.
your.
So this book works not only as a biographical sketches and essays on governors, but also a history of Florida in a sense too. If you look at it, if you break it all up in chronological order.
That's something I wanted to mention back when Mike was talking about William Pope Duval. You can recognize what you see in the newspapers every day today in the problems that he experienced as governor, officially and personally. Florida politics has always been a very bitter game, and people have played for real stakes from the very beginning. And that's one thing about the governor's book as a whole. It's almost like a course in how to understand the newspaper, because you will find yourself realizing that what is happening today, whether on the national level or the state level, is nothing new. And I think that can give people not only a context in which to make the decisions they have to make, but offer some reassurance. And in the governor's book, Boyd has designed it in such a way that it is entertaining as well as educational. He stressed smooth flowing prose and interesting writing, and chose authors to try and encourage that. And I think people will really enjoy it. I did want to say too about, you have up there the Cracker Times book.
Yes.
That we just had a ball.
What was the date on that book? That was
1997? Is that,
Yeah, but then
is that
it was
when
and
it
then
came out, or
again in
98?
2000, second edition in 2000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't even know we had a second edition.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. But I
It's still in print.
wanted to mention it's divided into 2 parts. One is a series of letters that a man named George Gillette Keene wrote from near Lake City in Columbia County in the 1830s through the 1870s, and he had published in the local newspaper. And he was funny, and he had a wry take on life and the people he had known. And it's all true, given a
Kinda
little
like Mark
bit of
Twain. It's kinda like reading
exaggeration.
Mark Twain.
Yeah,
But it's all true. These stories, they're funny stories, they're embellished, but they're real people. And it didn't take long, particularly Cantor was able to recognize these individuals because of his other work that he'd done in Reconstruction. I mean, these people are all real people, and we didn't know a whole lot about them, but now we do know a little bit more about them. And some of the stories, we knew the general vague notions of some of these stories.
Some we didn't believe it.
But they,
They're true.
They were, they're, and the other neat thing about the book, which is that it was about a cattleman, George, and he, of course, ran cattle all the way from Columbia County, which is all the way up to the state line, and he ran cattle all the way right through here, all the way to Tampa Bay. And so he was coming back and forth, and a lot of the families in the book ended up settling here in Polk County.
These
in
are the
next
founders
generation.
of Polk County.
Yeah. So
almost
the
to a
names-
man and a woman.
Back in the old days when you had telephone books, okay, we don't have telephone books anymore, but you could go to the telephone book and look up Keene. There's a whole page of Keenes. You look up Rollerson. There's a half a page of Rollersons. You look up some of the other names.
All Lakeland names.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But they're great stories. The smaller part of the book is a woman's reminiscence, Sarah Pamela Williams. Her father had been a very distinguished person in territorial Florida.
In fact,
worked with
Duval-
William Pope Duval.
Duval appointed him. He was one of the two men who rode horses from Pensacola and St. Augustine to meet in Middle Florida and actually founded the Tallahassee, the site, at least for the state capital. And that was her father,
Yeah.
John Williams.
And whereas George Keene was this kind of rough-hewn cracker character, she was a very sophisticated planter's daughter and planter's wife whose world got turned upside down by the Civil War. And she writes about not only her earlier life and her father, but how her life got turned upside down. It's very poignant, it's almost, I guess in real terms, she and Keene were living in separate worlds, even though their homes were just a few miles apart.
No indication they knew each other, but they lived, right near each other. Yeah. And explain how you discovered those stories. You were actually working, and this is the way it always goes. You're doing research on one thing, but you end up discovering something else.
Well, I've got to give credit to another friend of ours, David Coles, who is the preeminent historian at Longwood University,
yeah,
in Farmville, Virginia, and a top quality Civil War expert. But he used to work in the state archives back in the 90s, and we all became friends. Mike and David were in their doctoral programs together. And I was researching Hart, the Hart biography, or finalizing work on it. And he said, we got some old Lake City newspapers microfilmed. And there's this guy writing all these old stories, and you might find something helpful. And so I went up to the, what was then the State Library, Florida collection, and started looking at these, and I couldn't believe how wonderful these stories were. And I was afraid that sometimes I get a little carried away, and Mike brings me back to the earth. So I copied them all and Xeroxed them and sent them to him. I said, you got to look at this. Is this as good as I think it is? And his response was, we got to do a book. And we just had a delightful
It was about,
time.
2 years, and the 2-year period, that is they were serialized articles, which were very common back then. Weekly newspapers would serialize letters.
He called himself Black Eye.
He called himself Black Eye, and from Catch-All, and of course Alligator is the name of the city back then, right? Not Lake City, but so it was just a delightful thing, and it was basically a matter of transcribing all the stories, and then
And then figuring out.
and then
if they were
figuring out
true.
if they were true or not, and then going back to the traditional historical sources, which unfortunately in that region in Columbia County, the court records are gone, really, but you can still piece together a lot of information from other sources. And I think, and I think Cantor would agree with me, that this book, in a way, kind of fits as a history of that region during the time. Almost.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
it does.
But in the absence of a lot of traditional sources.
But
Yeah.
That's wonderful, though, to blend the stories in with the, grounded in the historical resources. So I know that, we're all suffering from COVID and we're trying to stay, isolated, but to historians, I can't imagine that you're just sitting twiddling your thumbs. So I wanted to take this next little segment of our program this evening, and can you enlighten us on any new projects that we can look forward to? I'll let you start, whoever wants to begin. Dr.
Want to give
Denham?
it a go?
I guess so, I reckon. Well, I found myself, let's see, it was last spring when everything shut down. You remember when all of a sudden the schools had to start shutting down and so forth. I found myself working remotely at home and doing my classes at home, and I soon discovered I could probably do a lot of that in like 2 days, because I was basically just loading things into a platform of some sort. And I decided to pull out a project that I had started in graduate school. I discovered in graduate school, and it was about a naval officer that I had discovered who had murdered the U.S. attorney in the streets of Key West. Sensational murder. Occurred in 1829. And I wrote about the murder a little bit, and in my first book, it's about a page and a half in the book and all that. It's really sensational, kind of a thing. And this guy was a Mexican naval officer, but he had a name that wasn't Hispanic. So anyway, all of that intrigued me, and then I started doing some research on the Texas Revolution, and this is in grad school, and all of a sudden this guy's name starts turning up. And turns out he had become involved in the Texas Revolution. He got off from this murder. He was exonerated because he had killed the seducer of his wife. Okay, the unwritten law, right? The unwritten law. Anyway, he got off, and next thing you know, he's first Commodore of the Texas Navy. Okay, and so I'm just, wow, this is really interesting. Of course, all the Texas Navy or the Texas Independence Movement papers are published, basically. I mean, Sam Houston's papers are published. The papers of the Texas Revolution are published in like many volumes. And so next thing you know, I'm digging and trying to find this guy. And then I start getting hold of some New Orleans newspapers and then other newspapers. And then, 25 years go by, and I pull out this project again, and now we've got all these newspaper databases online, right?
They are.
So next thing you know,
Our lives have been revolutionized.
so next thing you know, I'm pulling out all these boxes of things that I had been saving over the last 25 years. And, I have Hawkins even a little bit Hawkins is involved in the Duval book to a certain extent. I mean, so anyway, long story short, I started pulling it all together and I started writing. And so I do have a manuscript finished, and I've still got some things that I want to look up and look up about his life. So I basically, he didn't live very long, but he was involved in, like Duval, lots and lots of different things, privateering, piracy. He was in the U.S. Anti-Piracy Squadron. He hired on with the Mexican Navy, all of these different places. And he was involved I think he was involved in privateering for Colombia, for the new nation of Colombia, Gran Colombia in the 1830s. So again, it's a journey that you don't want to, in a way you don't want it to end, because if you finally finish it, you think you've finished it, right? So yeah, it's and then of course, and just recently I've also finished an essay on the 1838 Constitutional Convention of Florida, the first constitutional convention. I've finished an essay on that that's going to appear in a book on Florida Constitution. So that's what I worked on this summer. So hopefully, the Hawkins book will take shape. I'm not sure if
What's his name again?
Charles E. Hawkins. Charles E. Hawkins. He was born in in Kingston, New York. His father was a War of 1812 figure and a lawyer, and he joined the Navy at the age of 16 years old. He was a midshipman in the U.S. Navy. Went to the Mediterranean as a 16-year-old midshipman. I've discovered that part of his life. So it's just kind of an Atlantic Ocean, Caribbean kind of book. So anyway.
Sounds like it could be a movie.
Yeah.
Dr. Brown, what have you been working on?
Well, it's about a murder that took place 122 years after his murder. But can I ask him a question first? I want to put him on the spot a little bit here. Professor, now you keep bringing up these figures in Florida history who moved to Texas.
Yes.
Am I not correct that you had one figure who moved to Texas from Florida, but then came back to Florida to murder somebody in the streets of Tallahassee?
Yes, a man named Willis Alston. It's funny you mention that. First academic paper and also publication I ever did with the Florida Historical Quarterly was on a duel, an amazing duel which took place in Tallahassee, in which a prominent planner, wild guy, his name was Willis Alston, murdered in cold blood the U.S. Marshal, but previous to that was the general of the militia in Florida, Lee Reed, and after he was assaulted by this same figure, after killing his brother in a duel, he was named Speaker of the House in honor of his injury. He was actually injured and could not attend the state legislature, but his supporters named him honorary speaker while he was in convalescence. Willis Alston did not kill him, but he fled to Texas, jumped bail and fled to Texas, and then came back and then finished the job. About a year later, he actually did kill him, and of course this was a revenge thing because Lee Reed had killed his brother in a duel about a year earlier. So
now, did somebody then go to Texas and kill him?
Actually, it's kind of unclear. There were people in Texas that knew, I think, Reed and hated Alston just on general principles. And there was, of course, there may have even been some things that he had done in Texas to encourage people to hate him. But yeah, incredibly wild stuff. That all of that was in my first book.
Is in the Rogues?
It's in Rogues Paradise, yes. And it's also, I revisit the whole issue again in the Duval book because Duval was right in the middle of that stuff. Duval was out of office. He was not governor, but he was in Tallahassee at the time, and of course having all kinds of battles with Governor Reed, who I wrote about. In fact, that incident is in the essay that at least reference to it is in the essay that I wrote on Robert Raymond Reed, who's no relation to Lee Reed. So,
super
and of course, all of this was national news, and that's the other thing about the Hawkins murder that I ran across, and with the newspaper databases. And I'm not sure exactly what to do with this. I'm actually kind of carving out an article on the murder Hawkins killing the U.S. attorney down in Key West, I'm actually carving a lot of that out to do an article because it's just too much material. And I've discovered in these newspaper databases that it went viral. Back then, newspapers would reprint stories or incidents or just short blurbs in the 1820s and 30s. But this story was being reported up the entire Atlantic coast, New York, all the way to Boston, all the way through the entire Atlantic coast. There were stories about this incident. Part of it was the fact that the man he killed, a man named McCrae, was a pretty well-to-do man originally from Alexandria, Virginia. So people up there were all worked up about it and so forth as well. So, but the remarkable thing is that is how extensively this was covered. And of course, there are all kinds of interesting observations about Key West, where the climate is hot, where the emotions are hot, right? You know, the notion, of course, sultry atmosphere, which creates this element of violence, and also and of course the seduction, of course, of McCrae, of Hawkins's wife by McCrae, and all of that kind of stuff. And of course, there's West Indies stuff involved too, right? Because she's from the Bahamas, you know, and then they're going back and forth to Cuba all the time, you know, and all this kind of stuff like that. So, anyways, it's fun, interesting.
Very interesting.
Well, my murder
Yes.
took place here in Polk County.
In fact, there will probably be people watching this that may know about it.
I think almost surely there are. In 1951, an undertaker from Fort Meade, my hometown, who also had just bought a funeral parlor in Lake Wales, named Elwood North, was arrested for killing not an elderly, a 50-something-year-old woman who lived out near Lake Buffum, east of Fort Meade, between Fort Meade and Frostproof, named Betty Albritton. And it became a cause célèbre here in Polk County and was reported all over the country. In the end, in 1954, after appeals to the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court, Elwood North was executed. But as I was growing up in Fort Meade in the 50s and 60s, the town, as far as I could tell, was still split down the middle as to whether Elwood was guilty. And when my father died in 1974, at his graveside service, an elderly man who I didn't know took me aside and just began talking about Elwood North. And he said something that I couldn't let go of, and I still remember vividly. He said, "Cantor, you know they didn't execute Elwood for murdering Mrs. Albritton. They executed him for murdering his wife." And what had happened before Elwood moved to Fort Meade in 1946, he had lived in Tampa and earlier in Plant City, or near Plant City. And in 1943, he was newly remarried after a divorce. And he was cleaning a shotgun in the kitchen of his home and discharged it and killed his new bride. The police and prosecutors in Tampa concluded it was an accident. He, without controversy, was cleared. He joined the Merchant Marine, obviously this is during World War II, and served for the remainder of the war. Came out, married a girl from Frostproof, and moved to Fort Meade and opened a funeral parlor. So I never could let go of this. And there are others who have been fascinated with it as I have. And I don't know if I'll be able to write many more books because I'm approaching a certain age. But I wanted to make sure that I at least exhausted this fascination that I had. And I started looking into the book about a year and a half ago. And the more I looked into it, the more stunned I was at what eventually I came to believe was what happened. And I don't want to give away everything other than to say that what we think we know is not at all what happened. And I concluded that the real story here was the person who was left out of the scandal, who wasn't reported on, about whom almost nothing was known, and that was Betty Albritton. So this book, more than anything else, is Betty's story, as well as I'm able to piece it together. I'm still piecing it together. I will cover the trial and the aftermath of the trial, which itself is fascinating. But it's Betty's story. And I believe once you feel you understand the roots of her life and her experience, you'll understand what happened. And it's not necessarily a happy story. But it is rooted in the history of Polk County. And I really began with her grandmother, a cattle woman named Spicy Underhill Whidden, and take it through her son, Frank Jones's life, and then his daughter, Betty Albritton's life. And I hope that when a reader has gotten through the 5 or 6 chapters that that's going to take, that they will understand Betty, and they will sympathize with why she took the actions that she took, and that later were used against Elwood North. We're also going to drag the Baptist preacher in. We're going to drag the Ku Klux Klan in. We're going to drag the civil rights movement in. We're going to drag corrupt politicians, corrupt law enforcement officials, good old boy judges, and try and understand why Elwood North had to be convicted. And he did have to be convicted in the eyes of many people in that time. But I think it's a fascinating story. I think it will offer a glimpse at the reality of life in Polk County, and in particular the way the judicial system and law enforcement worked in the early 20th century, early and mid 20th century. And will also show that there were some remarkable people who did their very best to ensure that justice was done for Betty. But unfortunately, those people were few and far between relative to others who were acting from different motivations. So I think it's a gripping story.
And this was
Mike thinks I'm crazy, by the way.
But this was,
as does my brother in Fort Meade. But
this was also a national event.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tell about the Earl Stanley Gardner. This is amazing. This is amazing.
Mike's read the first chapter, and he knows it begins with me berating Earl Stanley Gardner for betraying Perry Mason.
Perry Mason.
But mostly our memory of Betty Albritton's death and Elwood North's trial and execution comes from an article that Earl Stanley Gardner wrote in 1956 for a Sunday supplement magazine that was that day's equivalent of, what do we call it today?
Parade
magazine.
Yeah.
And it was published all over the country, and I think set in concrete our perceptions of who these people were and what happened. And in particular, after particular, after particular, it is factually incorrect. And if you start off with factually incorrect information, the conclusions you reach also are going to be factually incorrect. So I kind of take Earl Stanley Gardner to task for betraying Perry Mason, who was my hero. I think I became a lawyer because of Perry Mason.
This sounds just totally fascinating. Both of your stuff, I can't wait to have it out so we can read it and bring you back to talk about those particular books. So we are going to take another kind of stage here at this program, and we had asked people from the community to send in questions that they would like to ask our historians. And so we're going to start with the questions, and let's get started. The first question is, what led both of you to pursue a career as a historian?
Well, I mentioned that I grew up in Fort Meade, and I love my hometown, and I unashamedly own up to it and thank the people I grew up around for always being supportive of me and kind to me. But our home was located right down the street from what then was thought of as the old fort in Fort Meade. There really was a fort. It really had been located there by George Meade, for whom it's named, and who later, of course, won the Battle of Gettysburg. And when I was in junior high, really, I began working first as a volunteer and then for a little bit of money at the local newspaper, the Fort Meade Leader, for Pat and Beth Cleveland. Wonderful, wonderful people. And then all of the old bound volumes of the Fort Meade newspapers back to 1908 were in the front office of the Leader. And during downtimes, I would go and leaf through them. And there were old reminiscences of pioneer settlers. And it was pretty interesting stuff, but it just didn't have the ring of truth to me. And I wanted to find out what had really happened. Sort of like with Elwood. I just couldn't let go of it. But I went on to college at FSU. That led me into law school. But I couldn't let go of the idea of researching that history. So in 1985, I was chief of staff to a member of Congress in Washington, Charles Hatcher of Southwest Georgia, still my friend. And I just decided if I didn't pursue what I had dreamed of doing, I never would be able to. I would have to make professional commitments that I just wouldn't be able to get out of.
We're glad you chose that route.
Oh, thank you, Luann. You and 50 people in Fort Meade are about that. But I came back and I researched a book called Florida's Peace River Frontier. And I'm delighted to say that it was well received. It's still in print in hardback. It'll be 30 years next year, which I think is pretty good. One of the all-time bestsellers for historical works at the press. And I'm very proud of it, and I think it's been very popular here in Polk County and throughout Southwest Florida. And once I got started, I couldn't quit. And I met I was living in St. Augustine when I was researching it. And there at a Florida Historical Society meeting at that magnificent Ponce de Leon Hotel that's now the Flagler College main building, I met Sam Proctor, who later became my lead professor at the University of Florida, and he offered to read the manuscript I had written. And he did, and he encouraged me not only, or he took it to the University Press of Florida, and they subsequently published it. But he insisted I come to the University of Florida and get a PhD and keep researching and writing. And I treasure the time that I had with Sam during those times. And his encouragement and his support, it just meant the world. And I've been doing it more or less ever since. Unfortunately, you also have to make a living. So I keep straddling the line between am I a researcher and a writer? Am I a lawyer? Am I an academician? And somehow it's all kind of made a mishmash together. But I'm officially retired now, so I can actually do what it is that I wanted to do all along, which was research and write, most notoriously about Elwood North.
Well, Dr. Denham, do you want to pick up on that?
Well, sure. It really comes down to three things. One is I had some really great teachers, and I had a lot of the same teachers that Cantor had, actually. And they were great role models. And I soon began to understand, you go to classes in college and, you do the courses, and all. But I soon discovered there was something a lot more than that. The folks that I had at FSU were just great teachers and inspiring and just everything else. But I would, as a student, you just kind of look around and you kind of see things. And particularly, all of a sudden you begin to think, well, where do these books come from? Where does history, how do you do history? And so I began to understand that, it takes a lot of hard work but I just kind of watched these people, these great, professors. And then curiosity, I was always curious about, particularly Florida history, my home. I'm a fifth generation Floridian, and I noticed that there was not a whole lot out there really on Florida history, much. You always do Virginia history or Massachusetts or whatever. And then the third thing is the fun and the excitement of actually doing research. Actually going to the courthouse, reading about the Reed Alston duel, and were they prosecuted in the courts for this? Were they prosecuted for assault and battery, or what about the laws at the time? Was this illegal? And then next thing you know, you're reading about things in the newspaper and reading everything around it to try to get a sense of the context of which this event occurred, and then I just got hooked. With the research and my doctoral research, for example. A lot of people, I think you're going to agree with me, Cantor, a lot of people look upon their doctoral period at the time they're in grad school with awful trepidations. In other words, oh my God, I never thought I'd get out. But I loved it. I actually loved it, and I loved the research because I went to every courthouse in antebellum Florida that existed in antebellum Florida and dug through all their court records, not knowing what I was going to find. Every day it was a treasure hunt, with these little brown papers with red ribbons tied around them that had been tied that way for over 150 years, and you open it and it's like, oh, what are you going to find? And then you have to try to make sense out of it. You have to try to make sense of what you're reading, and you think about it all the time, and you begin to get a sense of what it means, if it is relevant, is it not relevant, how it ties into this newspaper article that you've just read, or a diary or a letter of the time, and next thing you know. So anyway, the excitement of research and the curiosity which leads you from one thing to another. And these projects, they're all kind of related in a way. I mean, you as you're working on one project, you find something that can be expanded into another project that's not really been written on before. So it's, and you know, it just snowballed. I can't think of anything that I'd rather be doing or have done with my life up to this point than doing this, teaching and research and
I think you
and
should
writing.
point out too that you're a really gifted teacher.
Well, it's my day job, you know. It's and I enjoy it. I really enjoy it, and it's been a challenge, obviously, with this COVID business. That's for sure.
Well, I've seen your interaction with the students, and I would say, so glad that you chose this career.
Well, yeah. Well, I am too. I don't know what I would have enjoyed as much as this. It's been really a lot of fun.
Well, we're going to move on to the next question, which is a little bit of a loaded question when you ask historians this. But you know, people say, why should we study history? We can't make any changes in history. So, you know, what would two historians say to why do you think studying history is important?
I think it, maybe it's a cliche, but I think it offers you context for understanding life today. I don't think that it's as simple that history repeats itself, although dynamics and circumstances certainly recur all the time. But we were talking earlier about how the nature of Florida politics, how the lives of these governors and William Pope Duvall can offer a guide to understanding the nature of politics in Florida today, and not only how it developed, but how it operates, the heritage that is involved in it, the patterns, the dynamics. That's context. And Florida, I mean, I think we have a reputation as, how do we want to put it, being one of the more eccentric states.
Eccentrics? We have the Florida man, actually, don't we? We have the Florida man, right?
Yeah. But so many people have always been from somewhere else. And they may bring some perceptions to Florida of what they think it's like or what its past has been like. But unless they make some effort to really understand it, they haven't got a clue. Our colleague, the late Mike Gannon, used to love to tell audiences that people believe Florida history began when they crossed the state line. But it hasn't. We have heritage. We have a political culture and a social culture and mores and patterns that are set in concrete that affect us every day. And I think most discerning people would want to understand what those influences are so that they can better understand their own lives.
Thank you. Dr.
I don't think I could put it any better other than to say that one of the things that struck me when I was beginning to work on Duval and the territorial period is, of course, all of these people are newcomers. I mean, Duval was from Virginia by way of Kentucky. There were people here from New York, and there were conflicts, of course, among them because the New York faction hated the Virginia faction and all of that. And also, we think of Florida today as diverse, right? Miami, Panhandle, where we live today, all of that. And it was the same back then. It was absolutely the same as far as disjointedness, as far as different movements and different issues or factions and so forth. But again, the whole thing about history is human beings and people. And I've always found people incredibly interesting. Maybe I should have been a psychologist or something, but I think reading people's mail when they don't think you're ever going to be able to read it is a good way to learn about people, and of course the history or the challenges that they had to go through at the time, whether it be trying to protect themselves from Seminole War attacks or someone in the middle of nowhere with their family gone, or soldiers, of course, a long place away from where they're from. But understanding how people adjust or cope with trauma, with challenges, it's really the human experience that I think is the most important or most interesting to me. Now, Cantor knows better as well as I do that some historians don't think people are very important in the whole notion of history, are they? It's all about themes or trends or overarching ideologies or whatever. Paradigms, right.
Into historiography now.
So while we read that material and take stock of it, I guess, right? I don't want to speak for Canada, but what I find interesting is the people and trying to understand what makes them tick. What is it that in that Faulkner book where he asked Faulkner, who's at Harvard, or one of Faulkner's characters, he says, "What do those people in the South do? Why do they do it all?" or something. He's trying to understand what this strange world is that he's from.
Connection, identity.
How do they do it?
All sorts of
yeah.
stuff. So
every time I try to quote Faulkner, I mess it up. I do.
well, we're actually going to go into our last question for this evening before we're going to wrap it up. And we'd like to talk about where do you think the gaps are in our understanding of history, especially in state history and in local history? Where are we today?
Okay, I would like to say that the real place where we can learn about American history, first of all, is local history. I think the local scene and studying localities is a great, laboratory to really understand American history. But aside from that, I know Cantor and I have talked about this a lot, and we've talked about it with you, and that is African American history and women's history is really the hidden history that's right in front of our eyes that we don't really tend to focus on. But I'll let Cantor, of course, expand on that because I think he has some strong feelings.
I think you have
about
to
that.
start with the fact that Florida, which lags behind in so many areas like education and the availability of public services and such, does hold a major distinction. We can claim justifiably and honorably to be the last state in the nation to open a state archives. That has been our commitment to history. It is pathetic. You go to states across the nation, even some states that don't enjoy the greatest repute, and they have excellent facilities for historical research. They have wonderful libraries of already published material that you can then take. Florida doesn't have that. I mean, we've obviously had a couple of generations in the modern era where some inroads have been made, but even finding institutional support within the universities to research Florida history can be very problematic. I don't want to attack anybody's beloved university, but I know for a fact that there are major institutions whose history faculties look down on research in Florida history. And that is a shame. It seems to me Florida is a perfect laboratory for studying just about any issue in national history. And often it can be taken, like Mike says, to the local level, a micro study.
That's an example of that is that scholars from out of state are doing really good work in Florida history. There's any number of scholars writing on various subjects in Florida, but not Florida.
But one of the best instances of that is that in the field of race and African American history, one of the landmark books of the last generation is Emancipation Betrayed by University of Florida professor now, Paul Ortiz. Paul wrote it as his doctoral dissertation at the University of California, not at a Florida institution. Now, as I say, I was very fortunate that Sam Proctor, even though when I was there, the University of Florida was not particularly supportive of Florida history, but Sam was, and he was sort of a world of his own. And he encouraged me to do work in Florida and write the Ocean Hart biography. But there is not a huge reservoir of institutional support. There is not a huge reservoir of state support. In fact, what state support there is virtually all pass-through from the federal government. You say, I've got a state grant. Well, what you got was a National Endowment for the Humanities grant channeled through a state agency. And it's a shame. You just about cannot scratch the surface in any area of Florida, geographically, culturally, gender, any way you want to parse it, without finding marvelous, not always happy, not always positive, but fascinating, important information. And the people, like Mike says, the heroes and heroines, the villains, are just magnificent. I mean, we earned that reputation for our eccentricity in Florida, but we ought to know about it. We ought to know who molded that, who they were, what they did. And lots of them who did that were women. Lots of them who did that were African Americans. The state in which we live is indelibly marked by the contribution of individuals that we know nothing about. And that's a travesty, particularly in a state as fast changing as Florida has always been, because we get carried away with the change and think that the legacies of the past are gone. But like I was trying to make a point a minute or two ago, the legacies of the past are not gone. They persist. The patterns have been set long ago in many areas of life in Florida. We talked about politics, but not simply in politics. And it is important to know that. And it's important to know the players. And we know very little about that.
Local history is one of the first things that gets lost,
Yes.
in the greater studies.
Well, that's why what you're doing here is so special and important. It really
I
is.
appreciate everyone's
Yeah.
support. So I wanted to give Dr. Denham a chance to talk a little bit about the Center for Florida
Oh, okay.
History. As we know that the financial support to keep history going, it comes from our community. And just Dr. Denham's
Well,
website, if you want to talk about what's
Yeah,
coming.
sure. We've been very fortunate to get tremendous support from the community, and Florida Southern has been very generous to me in terms of supporting my activities with the Lawton Child Center for Florida History. And the premier thing that we do, really, we do oral histories and we do some other things, but the main thing we do is a lecture series. And up to this year, this was the first year in September that we did not have an opening night of the Florida Lecture Series since 1996. And I can tell you, guess who was the first opening speaker in 1996? I think it was 96.
I'm old.
Anyway, over the years we've had, governors and really important historians. I mean, real historians, right, Cantor?
I don't think you've had any of the That's what.
Anyway, we've just had a really, really great run, and again, we do get support from the community. Lots of wonderful people over the years have sent in donations and so forth, and the college has been tremendously supportive of making the center viable and keeping the center free. The lectures, the programs are all free. That was my commitment from the very beginning, and we've had school-age kids, elderly people, middle-aged people. We've had lots and lots of people over the years. And what's really neat is to see the people that come all the time, but then people come for the first time too. But obviously, we've not been able to have the live programs this year, but we whenever we can, we're going to start back running hard with a full program. And we've done a couple of Zoom programs so far, including this one. I consider this part of our Zoom outreach, or not Zoom, but public television, or whatever this is.
This is a real treat for us because usually you're not behind talking here.
So anyway, all I can say.
I mentioned the people whose generosity led to the creation of the Center for Florida History.
Yes, Sarah McKay, of course, is the key person who helped us get started and was with us all along in the tradition. And obviously, the Ruthven family and the Childs family has been tremendously supportive. Ed Childs, who lives, of course, now over in Anna Marie Island, and his family have just been wonderful. And a lot of their friends, obviously, have been supportive of our work from the very beginning, and we really just can't say enough about their support. So we're really looking forward to having the series back. I had so many ideas this year. Everything was already in place when we had to obviously pull the plug on the live programs this year. And so just stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
And we've got our website up there, and that website looks really long. I could never remember it.
No.
All I do is just Google, if I'm trying to get on the website, Google Center for Florida History, and it pops right up.
Mention the resources that are available on your
Oh yes, on the website we have we have oral histories scanned on the website, and you can go on there on the website and go to the link, and you can read oral history that I did with Governor Reuben Askew, Burt Kibler, who's a very leading figure in the community, the late Burt Kibler, and then we've got some people who were people you might not have ever heard of, but of course were law enforcement officers. We have a wonderful interview with a woman who was in the cigar worker industry, and she was a cigar maker in Tampa. And of course, Judge E.J. Salsinas is another one of our great oral histories that we've got. And there's also some lawyers that we have on the lectures on the oral history as well.
It's a wonderful resource for the community and for the state as well. So we are also expanding the Lakeland History and Culture Center. It will be built within the confines of the Lakeland Public Library. The city of Lakeland is providing funds to build, but the LHCC needs to fundraise to offset costs for the initial equipment and resources that are needed to put the exhibits in this 1,400 square foot expansion. So stay tuned for that as well. We're going to be kicking off some fundraising activities with the new year. So I want to spend a moment and thank to both of you, Dr. Mike Denham, Dr. Cantor Brown, for joining us and doing this wonderful presentation for us today. I hope we can do something like this again. We, again, like Dr. Denham is saying, we hope to offer more history-based programming in the future. COVID's kind of put the kibosh on that, but this format here, we're very thankful for the City of Lakeland to let us host this event here, right here in City Hall. And thank you for the staff from the library and from the city for helping make sure that this all went off without a hitch. We did have some audience here this evening, so thank you guys all for coming. And most of all, I want to thank everyone for being interested in local history, and let's just keep telling those stories. And thank you all so much. Thank you.